Assalamu alaikum, this is Snan, and today we're going to talk about the descending tracts. We're going to talk about the modern division of the descending tracts, the primitive division of the descending tracts, the simplest order of the descending tracts. We're going to talk about some important descending tracts along with the simple but informative diagrams. So let's start. Descending tracts. The descending tracts are a bundle of axons which move from high center of brain to the spinal cord. So they conduct motor info like movements, reflexes, postures, and visual activities. Now, descending tracts, as I have said, that they consist of motor neurons. So the motor neurons are of two types, that is, one, those are in the central nervous system and those which are out of it, the lower and upper motor neurons. The lower one are out of central nervous system and move from CNS, central nervous system, to neuromuscular junction, while the upper one moves are the axons which move from the higher center to the lower motor neuron. Now, the upper motor neuron is further divided into the corticular origin tracts and the subcorticular origin tracts. The corticular origin tracts are those which originate in the cerebral cortex. It includes these corticospinal tracts and corticonuclear. The corticospinal are for the spinal nerves, while the corticonuclear are for cranial nerves. The subcorticular origin tracts have their origin below the cerebral cortex. So these includes the tectospinal, rubrospinal, reticulospinal, the vestibulospinal, and the oliviospinal tracts. We're going to talk later about them. So another type of division, which is a primitive division, includes the division of upper motor neurons into pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. Pyramidal tracts include the corticospinal and the nuclear tracts, and they are defined by the definition that they pass through the pyramids of the medulla. Now, extrapyramidal tracts are the tracts of subcorticular origin. Here is a simple diagram of medulla. This whole area is medulla. Now, the medial portion, medial swelling, which contains the pyramidal fibers, is known as pyramidal area, while the lateral swelling, which contains the inferior olivary nucleus of medulla, is the olivary area. So those fibers which pass through the pyramidal area of medulla are known as pyramidal fibers. So now the simplest order of the descending tracts. The descending tract starts from the first order neuron, which are present in the cerebral cortex. Then they move downward and synapse with the second order neuron, which are the interneurons in the gray column of the spinal cord. Then they move to the gray matter, and then they move up to the gray matter and synapse with the lower motor neurons. Now, from the lower motor neurons, the third order neurons move into the neuromuscular junctions and other parts of the body, which are the effectors. Now, here's a note. Sometimes the axon of first order neuron, which are from the cerebral cortex, may terminate directly on the third order neuron, which are the lower motor neurons in the anterior gray column. It is particularly seen in the reflex arc. Now, talking first about the tracts of cortical origin from the cerebral cortex, we have an important one, that is corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract is involved in the rapid, skilled, and voluntary movement, especially of the distal areas of the body. Now, they start from the primary neuron. They start from the pyramidal cells, which are present in the fifth layer of cerebral cortex. This is a simple diagram of a cerebral cortex. This is cerebral cortex, and cerebral cortex contains a lot of layers. This one shows the fifth layer, which contains these pyramid shaped cells, which are known as the pyramidal cells. So from the pyramidal cells which take origin, the fibers take cells from two-thirds from the motor cortex of the cerebral cortex and one-third cells give fiber from the sensory cortex. The motor cortex include the primary motor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex, while the sensory cortex area include the post-central gyrus. The involvement of sensory cortex ensures the proper functioning of the motor activity along with the sensory input. Here it is the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex. This line is known as central sulcus. Anterior to it is the motor cortex, while posterior to it is the sensory cortex. This is the post-central area behind, just behind the central sulcus is the sensory, and this area is known as the post-central gyrus I have talked about. While anterior to it is the motor cortex, the area immediately anterior to the central gyrus is the primary motor cortex, while anterior to the primary motor cortex superiorly presents the supplementary motor cortex, so secondary motor cortex, and below it is the premotor cortex. So from the pyramidal cells, the fiber passes, making a corona radiata, passes through the posterior limb of internal capsule. So here the fiber passes through the internal capsule and the area is the posterior limb and then goes downward. Then they pass through the basis pedunculi of the midbrain, that is middle 3-5. What are the pedunculi? Pedunculi are the white matter which connects the brain to its stem. Now this one is the midbrain and its central 3/5 area contains the pedunculi, basis pedunculi. From here, as shown in this side, the fibers of the corticospinal tract passes down to the pons. So below the tract, as soon as it passes through the midbrain, the tract is broken down into bundles. In pons, it forms the transfer pontocerebral fibers, while in medulla, it forms the pyramids, which I have explained earlier are the swellings on the anterior aspects of the medulla. So here the fibers, when they reach the pons, break down into a number of fibers, and from the pons arises the transfer pontocerebral fibers which move from the pons to the cerebellum. Now then the fiber further descend, and at the junction of medulla and the spinal cord, 90% of the fiber decussate while 10% don't. Those which decussate form the lateral corticospinal tract, while which don't decussate form the anterior corticospinal tract. Both of these tracts synapse with the second order neuron in the anterior. Both of these neurons and both of these tracts pass through the anterior gray column of the spinal cord, where they synapse with the second order neuron, which is the interneuron of the spinal cord. This is the upper part of medulla, the fiber descend, and at the lower part of the medulla, which forms a junction with the spinal cord, the 90% of fiber decussate in red, as shown in red line, and the 10% don't decussate in, as shown in the black line. So the red one and the black one both passes through the white column into the anterior gray column, where they synapse with the interneurons of the spinal cord. Since interneurons are short, they immediately synapse with the lower motor neurons. The types include the alpha and the gamma motor neurons, and this is the tertiary synapse. The lower motor neurons then take them to the effectors. And now talking about the branches of the corticospinal tract. The branches, corticospinal during its descent give branches to the cerebral cortex in order to inhibit the adjoining areas, while it also gives branches to the caudate and lentiform nuclei of the basal ganglia, to the red nuclei of the midbrain and the reticular formation. All these branches keep the subcortical region, which is below cerebral cortex, informed, and this information give them a pathway to affect the lower motor neurons, especially the alpha and the gamma neurons. Now, the subcortical origin tracts, which are below the cerebral cortex. These includes the reticulospinal tracts. The reticulospinal tract have their fibers from the reticular formation. Reticular formation is a collection of nuclei in the midbrain, medulla and the pons. So, the fibers from the reticular formation at the level of pons, at the level of medulla and the midbrain. When the fibers at the level of pons form the pontine reticulospinal tract, while at the level of medulla form the medullary reticulospinal tract. The pontine reticulospinal tract move through the anterior white column, while the medullary one move to the lateral white column of the spinal cord. Both of these merge at the anterior gray column of the spinal cord, where they form a secondary synapse with the interneurons. This area shows the reticular formation, collection of neurons. So the reticular formation at the level of this is the pons, give rise to the pontine reticulospinal tract shown here and here, while at the level of medulla it gives rise to medullary reticulospinal tract, both of which form a synapse with the interneuron at the anterior gray column. Then from the anterior gray column they synapse with the lower motor neurons and then to the effector. The branches of the reticulospinal tract include the descending autonomic fibers. So they affect the visceral actions and include the so they affect the visceral actions. Reticulospinal tract influence the voluntary movement and reflexes. Now talking about the rubrospinal tract, rubrospinal tract influences the flexes in the positive way and degrades the action of extensors. So rubrospinal tract, they start from the fibers from the red nuclei. The anterior large portion of the midbrain is tegmentum, while the posterior swelling is tectum. So in the tegmentum, the red nuclei is present from where the rubrospinal tract fibers originate. So these fibers decussate at the same level of their origin. Then they descend further and move through the lateral white column, then the anterior gray column where the synapse with the interneurons, and then with the with the lower motor neurons. Here they arise from the red nucleus, decussate at the same time, descend, moves through the lateral white column of the spinal cord, and here they synapse with the interneuron, here shown in this black little line, interneuron in the anterior gray column, which then synapse with the lower motor neuron. That was the rubrospinal tract. The branches include the branches from the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, which affects its synapse portion with the lower motor neuron. Now talking about the vestibulospinal tract, which is opposite to the rubrospinal tract, that is it influences negatively the flexors while influences positively the extensors. So vestibulospinal tract take fiber from the lateral vestibular nucleus. Now what is vestibular nucleus? Vestibular nucleus is present in pons and medulla, just here below the fourth ventricle, as shown here, this oval circle. The vestibular nucleus has four portions: superior, lateral, medial and inferior. In the case of vestibulospinal tract, it takes origin from the lateral area of the vestibulospinal nucleus. Now fibers from the nucleus do not decussate and descend further down to the anterior white column and finally at the anterior gray column, where they synapse with the interneuron and then with the lower motor neurons. Branches includes from the inner nerve via the vestibular nerve and the cerebellum. Here the branch from the ear is shown, denoting the vestibular nerve, and the branch from the cerebellum. So here is the vestibular nucleus. From its lateral part, the vestibulospinal tract descends through the anterior white column and then synapse at the anterior gray horn column of the spinal cord with the interneuron, which then synapse with the lower motor neurons. Now the fun thing about rubro and the vestibulospinal tract, which are opposite to each other, is that the rubrospinal tract is assisted by the medullary reticulospinal tract, while the vestibulospinal tract is assisted by the pontine reticulospinal tract. Seems difficult? I have a mnemonic for it. It is that sit on a rubber mat. You are sitting on a rubber mat. The S denotes the sitting, which includes the function of flexus, so it enhances flexus. The R denotes the rubrospinal tract, whose function is to enhance the flexus, while the M denotes the medullary reticulospinal tract, which helps the rubrospinal tract in sitting. So sit on rubber mat. In case of vestibulospinal tract, we have a mnemonic VIP, just like our elders, when they come into the room, we stand up with respect. So VIP helps you stand up. So V denotes the vestibulospinal tract. The P denotes the pontine reticulospinal tract, which assists the vestibulospinal tract in standing up. Standing up includes the anti-gravity muscles, which are the extensors. So vestibulospinal tract helped by the pontine reticulospinal tract enhances the extensors. Now Olivospinal tract. Olivospinal tract arises from the inferior olivary nucleus. As I've explained, the medulla has a pyramidal portion and olivary portion, and the olivary portion swelling is formed by the underlying inferior olivary nucleus. So from this inferior olivary nucleus, fibers arise and decussate in the brain stem. Then they descend down in the lateral white column, and from the lateral white column they move to the anterior gray column, where they synapse with the interneurons, and those interneurons further synapse with the lower motor neuron. Here is the inferior olivary nucleus in the medulla, olivary region of medulla. The fiber decussate at the level of brain stem, then descend down in the lateral white column, then move to the anterior gray horn. In the anterior gray horn, it synapse with the interneuron, and then the interneuron synapse with the motor neuron. That is the olivospinal tract. Its function is not well known. Now the tectospinal tract. The tectospinal tract is involved in the visual reflex, that the movement of eye along with the movement of the body. Movement of the body along with the movement of the eye. So tectospinal tract arises from the superiorcolliculus. A simple diagram: medulla, pons, and this area is the midbrain. Now at the posterior aspect of midbrain are two swellings known as tectum. The upper one is known as the superior tectum, and the lower one is known as the inferior tectum. As shown here, this is the posterior aspect of midbrain. These are the swellings known as the superiorcolliculus, and the rest of the area is known as tegmentum, which is the anterior area. Superiorcolliculus, and below it is another swelling known as the inferior colliculus. So fibers from the superior colliculus decussate soon after their origin, move to the anterior white column, then the anterior gray horn, synapse with the interneuron, and then with the lower motor neuron. Here is the superior colliculus nuclei, superior colliculus, this side and this side. So the fibers arise from here, decussate soon after their origin, pass through the anterior white column, and then synapse with the interneuron, here as shown here in the anterior gray horn, which then synapse with the lower motor neuron. This is also shown here is that the superior colliculus is connected with the eye, so it is involved with the visual reflex. Lastly, the descending autonomic fibers. They control, as they are autonomic, control the sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow. They are from an unknown neuron in the higher center. Fibers arise, decussate in the brain stem, move to the lateral white column, and then lateral gray column. Up till now we have talked only about the anterior gray column, but these descending autonomic fibers move to the lateral gray column of the spinal cord, where they synapse with the autonomic motor neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic roles. So these descending autonomic fibers, as explained earlier, are involved in the sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow. Now the last portion of our lecture are the fun facts. As I've explained that there are superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. So superior colliculus, I have said that they are involved in the visual reflex. So have you thought that what is the role of the inferior colliculus? What is the role of the inferior colliculus? The answer to this is that inferior colliculus is involved in the auditory reflex. And that's all for today. Please subscribe the channel and thank you.
Yep.